Hi guys, and welcome to the Stephen King Sematary Club. Hi guys, welcome to the Haunted Valley. We are in the second episode now of the Stephen King Sematary Club. We are covering Salem's Lot, which is my favorite Stephen King. I am always hesitant to come up with a favorite, but in all honesty, it's probably my favorite of his books. It's definitely the one I own the most copies of. I think off the top of my head, I've got 6 copies. So I'm just gonna say it. It's my favorite. It's my favorite of all of Stephen King's stuff. So I will be using this version, the pocketbook version. And this one is a little beefier than the Signet book, but this is the one that I bought specifically to write in. Like, I underline things, I write in the margins. This one is definitely purchased with the sole intention of it being my academic copy, I guess you'd call it. So that's what I will be referencing page number wise. I wrote down notes here, but I'm also going to have to refer to the paperback because I have found that with this one, I have entire passages that I would like to share with you, and that's not really convenient because writing that all out is going to take forever. Salem's Lot is Stephen King's second novel. It was published in 1975 by Doubleday, and Stephen King wrote an introduction in the copy that I am using. He wrote an introduction in the 90s, and he was saying that reading Dracula at a young age kind of laid the groundwork for this book. So it's kind of a modernized version of Dracula, and once again, Tabitha, his wife, was very important in the origin of this book because he was just thinking out loud one night about, what would happen if Dracula was transported to the modern age, and he kind of laughingly said he'd just be hit by a car and then that would be that. But Tabby said, what if he ended up somewhere very isolated and rural where he could take over an entire town? And that got Stephen King thinking about it, and Salem's Lot was born. This is the pocketbooks edition, which has 631 pages. Now I will be going through the prologue and through chapter 2, which is Susan part 1. Okay, so the prologue basically talks about a boy and a tall man. It doesn't really describe who they are or what their deal is. This man and this boy, who is not his son, it is made clear it's not his son, they are traveling from Maine all the way to Mexico. He's a writer, we know that, but he's taken odd jobs along the way to survive so that they can live, and he is working on a book, which he sends into a publisher. Once it gets accepted, they cross over into Mexico, and they hang out there. The boy starts going to church, the man goes with him, the boy decides to make a confession, and he confesses a crazy tale that we don't really have much information about yet. But the priest seems very concerned by this, by the things that the boy has confessed. So the town that we focus on in this book is called Jerusalem's Lot, which is also shortened to Salem's Lot, which is the title, and that's why there is an apostrophe before the word, because it's cutting out Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's Lot is also Salem's Lot, and then the people who live there also just refer to it as the lot. So the tall man has been keeping up on news pertaining to Salem's Lot. So he is reading newspapers and he is keeping an eye out for any mention of Salem's Lot, which is where they came from. And there is an article about how Salem's Lot is basically now a ghost town. It's just abandoned. There are no businesses open, there are no children in the school, a lot of the houses are just empty, no one is walking down Main Street, that kind of thing. A lot of the citizens have just up and left, or were taken or something. No one really knows exactly what. They've tracked down a few people and they mention them in the article, and then they also list off a whole bunch of people that they are curious about what happened to them, haven't heard from them, but would like to hear from them. The man and the boy has been traumatized by something. We don't exactly know what it is, but he is very upset, and the tall man is kind of treating him gingerly. And they decide at the very end of this prologue that they need to go back to Salem's Lot. So that is the end of the prologue. Then we jump into part 1, which is the Marston House. And something that Stephen King does, and I've always appreciated this because it gives me new things to look for, I guess. He quotes songs, he quotes excerpts from books or poems, and if I have not already been exposed to them, I will usually check them out because I trust Stephen King and our tastes are pretty similar. He doesn't lead me astray. So at the beginning of this part is my favorite excerpt from The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and I did not read that novel until I had already read this little excerpt, and I was intrigued by it. I wrote it down so that I would go check it out. They might have used this exact line in the miniseries, the Netflix miniseries, but it is, quote, "Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone." Now we get into chapter 1, which is Ben number 1. This establishes a time frame for us. We know that it is the 5th of September, 1975, and Ben Mears is traveling to Salem's Lot. He lets us know that he was 7 years old when he lived here in Salem's Lot, which was 25 years ago, and he is coming back. As he's driving, he starts thinking, quote, what was he doing coming back to a town where he had lived for 4 years as a boy, trying to recapture something that was irrevocably lost? It's on page 19. And we start getting hints of a tragedy that had happened recently to his wife, Miranda. And we don't get the details, but we know it has something to do with a motorcycle and a car accident. And then we get some just gorgeous description in these first. This whole book has really great descriptions, so I'm just going to read passages. This is on page 20. The trees, mostly pine and spruce, rose in gentle slopes toward the east, seeming to almost crowd against the sky at the limit of vision. From here, the town was not visible. Only the trees, and in the distance, where those trees rose against the sky, the peaked gabled roof of the Marston House. The sight of the house gives Ben goosebumps, so we know there's something slightly off or creepy about this house. This is a longer description. It was just the same. There was no difference, not at all. He might have last seen it yesterday. The witchgrass grew wild and tall in the front yard, obscuring the old frost-heaved flagstones that led to the porch. Chirring crickets sang in it, and he could see grasshoppers jumping in erratic parabolas. The house itself looked toward town. It was huge and rambling and sagging, its windows haphazardly boarded shut, giving it that sinister look of all old houses that have been empty for a long time. The paint had been weathered away, giving the house a uniform gray look. Windstorms had ripped many of the shingles off, and a heavy snowfall had punched in the west corner of the main roof, giving it a slumped, hunched look. A tattered no trespassing sign was nailed to the right-hand newel post. That's on page 21 through 22. There's a lot of the house looking at the town, or a lot of people's eyes being drawn to the house. Just a lot of personality is given to the house. And there's a passage later on, and I don't know if we'll get to it in this section, but it says something about the house having gained proper noun status because it is so important. Ben sees the Marston House. He obviously has history with it. On page 22, quote, it stared back at him with idiot indifference. And page 23, quote, "It had waited for him." So there's a lot of personality assigned to this house. And we hear Ben say that he wants to lease the house and write his book inside of it, but he doesn't want to go upstairs. So we know he's afraid of the upstairs part of this house. That brings us to chapter 2, which is titled Susan, part 1. And now we're at the 16th of September. Ben meets Susan Norton in a park, and they have a very meet-cute situation on their hands. He has written I think he's written 3 novels actually, and she has one of them. And she's in the park reading this book, and she kind of realizes that the guy in the park is the guy on the book jacket that she is currently reading. So she knows that he's Ben Mears, and he comes over to her, and it's kind of one of those, can you believe the craziness of this situation? And it's really cute. She asks him to autograph it, and he does, even though it's a library book, and she says that she'll just replace it and, give them the new book at the library. And he says, well, you're going to have to steal it because this one is out of print. So it's just very cute. They have a very easy first meeting. The situation itself is very humorous and not likely, but it's one of those things that, is very adorable. So with this little having met each other in the park thing, Ben later thinks about it as being like a sinister, manipulated event, kind of like a fateful thing where everything just fell into place in just the way that something, not necessarily evil, but something that had malicious intent, I guess, would have set things in motion. And that's why things were so easy and convenient and everything fell into place. So they end up going for ice cream sundaes, and while they're sitting there, Ben tells Susan, this is a great way for us to get backstory on Ben, basically, in his history. Ben's dad died, and then his mother had some sort of a nervous breakdown, and she passed Ben off to his Aunt Cindy, and she lived in Salem's Lot. So Ben lived there for about 4 years, and I think he said that he left a month after the Great Fire, which was in 1951. And Susan said that she was born in 1951. So as they part ways, Ben looks up at the Marston House because it's very visible most places in town, maybe everywhere in town. You can just see the house looming over the whole town. And, quote, he remembered that the Great Forest Fire of 1951 had burned almost to its very yard before the wind had changed, on page 34. So it kind of makes it seem like there was some force at work that turned the fire away, since it got almost to the yard of this creepy house, and then it all of a sudden went the opposite way. Then we are introduced to Nolly Gardner and Perkins Gillespie. They are the deputy and the sheriff of this town, or the constable, I guess. And they are very opposite beings. Nolly is very ambitious and eager, and he is very excited about being a police officer, and Perkins is just kind of chill and, it's just his job, and that's that. They're kind of like Barney Fife and Andy Griffith, or at least that's how I perceive them. Let me get into a little bit of the town history. So Jerusalem's Lot was incorporated in 1765, and it was named after a pig that went feral. The pig's name was Jerusalem, and it ran into the woods and turned mean, and the owner used to kind of scare the kids and say, stay away from Jerusalem's woodlot. So that just got shortened into Jerusalem's Lot. So the way the town is set up is a big, like a site, which I translate to like an asphalt cross. Because you have 2 crossroads, Jointner Avenue and Brock Road. Or Brock Street, sorry. And they make like a cross. And so just the symbolism, because vampires, Catholicism, Christianity, whatever you want to call it, that's how I interpret it. And so you've got two big streets that cross, and then you have a town that's just basically in quadrants. And then another interesting fact is that, quote, most of the telephone lines were 2, 4, or 6 party connections. That's on page 40. So I've heard of party lines before, and I think my parents had them when they were kids. I cannot imagine sharing a telephone with 6 people. I mean, think of how much spying would go on. You know, I wouldn't want to share with another family, let alone 6 families. Okay, so that gives a little basic history of the town. We find out that there are pretty much some, you know, random and isolated tragedies, but nothing really major happens to reflect what is going on in the broader world. You know, they've had a couple people who had gotten injured in war and came back, or people who might have died in war, but it's not very common. And there's a great quote. Okay, quote, "But except for these things, the lot's knowledge of the country's torment was academic. Time went on a different schedule there. Nothing too nasty could happen in such a nice little town. Not there." End quote. That's on page 42. Susan's mother is Anne Norton, and she is very meddlesome and very annoying. Susan's mom seems to have this idea of her daughter marrying a guy that she's been seeing for a while, Floyd Tibbets, and being a good little girl, and she just wants her all neatly wrapped up in like a little bow kind of thing, and she does not like the idea of Ben Mears. So Susan and Ben have their date. They drive to another city and go watch a movie. And on the way home, they start talking about the Marston House, because it seems like the Marston House always comes up, no matter what. And Ben says that he tried to rent it, and it has been sold, which is odd, because it had been empty for so long. Quote, "The scandal and violence connected with the house had occurred before their births, but small towns have long memories and pass their horrors down ceremonially from generation to generation." Page 49. So now we have the Marston House, a brief history, basically. Hubert and Bertie Marston moved to Salem's Lot in 1928. They were very wealthy. Hubert was the president of a New England trucking company in the late 1920s, and he basically ran moonshine. So that's how he made all this money. He would get envelopes of cash, and he would get newspapers delivered all the time, and they had cash like taped to the pages. So they lost a lot of their money in the crash of 1929, and they basically lived like hermits until their deaths in 1939. So most of the town did not see them. No one went into their house. You know, they only went out to go shopping, basically. And the mailman discovered the bodies once all of the mail started accumulating, and he decided to bring it to the house. And there was a bad smell, and he found Bertie in the kitchen, and she had been shot in the head. And then he went and got the cops. They came back and found that the house was pretty much booby-trapped, like everywhere. And it was a hoarder's paradise. Like there was stacks of papers and magazines and like tunnels where you'd have to weave in and out of these stacks of junk. And the front door had a shotgun pointed at it and loaded, so that whoever opened the front door was supposed to get shot. And then they went upstairs, and Hubie Marston was hanging from the ceiling in one of the upstairs bedrooms. So he had hanged himself. Susan and Ben are still driving, and they are talking about how Ben has been inside the Marston house. He went once as a child. He wanted to belong to a club of boys, and they insisted that he go in and bring something out to prove that he had been in there. Ben went in on a dare and he grabbed a snow globe. Then he continued upstairs and he saw Hubie Marston hanging from a beam in the moonlight. And he said that Hubie opened his eyes and he screamed and he ran away. And he still has the snow globe. So then he has this excellent explanation of like this ghostly energy type situation. And I will read that to you because it's quite long. I didn't write it down. Because Susan asks him, "You don't really think that you saw Hubert Marsden?" And Ben says, "I don't know. He said it with difficulty and reluctance, as if he would rather have said no and closed the subject thereby. Probably I was so keyed up that I hallucinated the whole thing. On the other hand, there may be some truth in that idea that houses absorb the emotions that are spent in them, that they hold a kind of dry charge. Perhaps the right personality, that of an imaginative boy, for instance, could act as a catalyst on that dry charge and cause it to produce an active manifestation of something. I'm not talking about ghosts precisely. I'm talking about a kind of psychic television in 3 dimensions, perhaps even something alive, a monster, if you like." And I love the explanation because that's just so possible. I don't know. I feel like it's possible. Maybe it's not. But it just seems very possible to me that maybe things are activated by certain other things, certain events. That's why some people have experiences, other people don't. I don't know. But yeah, I really liked that. That's on page 56. I don't know if I said that. So yeah, brilliant. So Susan and Ben have a nightcap on the porch of the boarding house that Ben is staying at. And they have a view of the Marston House, of course, because everything looks at the Marston House. And they notice that there's a light on inside. So they say goodnight. Ben is, in his boarding house room. And he has actually chosen that room because it has a view of the Marston House. So he can see that the light is still on, and then he goes to sleep, and he has that same dream that he was telling Susan about, of the thing that happened to him as a child, where he had gone into the house, saw Hubie Marsden, saw him open his eyes, and then he ran and left. But what he didn't tell Susan, and he tells us, is that the door was locked when he tried to get out. So, spooky. We have talked about the first 3 chapters of Salem's Lot. So, I'm sorry, the first 2 chapters of Salem's Lot in the prologue. That was it. So now we are on chapter 3, which is the Lot 1. Now this has a lot of mini subchapters in it, and it introduces us to the town and some of the people in the town. And I like it because Stephen King goes, he'll list a time and then he will tell you about an event happening, or he'll cover an entire little subchapter of a person. This is a great way to quickly introduce people. So it's through the course of a day, and we get to meet some people that we haven't met yet. Salem's Lot has a huge cast of characters. And that's one of the things that when they made the miniseries, they had to combine a lot of characters because there are so many. And I know that I'm sure when I first read it, it was hard to keep track of all of them. And Tim said the same thing when I had him read Salem's Lot. He wanted me to make a list of all the characters. We're not even going to cover all of them. We're just going to cover most of the main ones. At 4 a.m., we have the Griffin boys, Hal and Jack. They are at the dairy farm. They work at the farm. It's their family business. Jack is a little goody two-shoes kid, and Hal is kind of resentful and kind of a sullen boy. 4:30 a.m., we're introduced to Win Purinton. He's the milkman. 5:15 a.m., we meet Eva Miller, who is the widow who owns the boarding house where Ben is staying. And her boarding house is full of lots of old men. And a lot of them are mentioned by name, but we won't worry about naming all of them. At 6:45, Mike Ryerson, he's the cemetery groundskeeper, and he takes care of the 3 cemeteries in town, and it only lists the names of 2 of them. There's Harmony Hill and Schoolyard Hill Cemetery. The third one, have no idea what it is. In this chapter, he finds a dead dog on the spikes of the cemetery gate, and I'm gonna have to start keeping track of this because dead dogs are a huge theme running through Stephen King books. The dog that Mike Ryerson finds is Doc. He is a Cocker Spaniel, and he belongs to the milkman, the guy that we just met a few chapters back. So he is hanging on the cemetery gates at Harmony Hill. Mike has to actually physically lift him up and off the spikes, and he puts him in his truck and is going to take him into the police when he goes for his lunch break. At 9 a.m. we meet Weasel Craig, whose real name is Ed, and he is the town drunk. He was once a lover to Eva, the boarding house person. He lives in the boarding house, and he basically lives there rent-free. He does odd jobs for Eva. 10 a.m. we meet Richie Bodden, and he is a school bully, and he has a fight with Mark Petrie, and Mark is the kid from the prologue. So he is with the tall man, who is Ben Mears. So that's our introduction to Mark. He is kind of nerdy, slender, delicate. He's able to beat Richie in a fight only because he is more clever and he is agile. 11:15, we meet the town dump custodian, who is a hunchback, and his name is Dud Rogers, and his big thing is he likes to shoot rats that are at the dump, and he likes to burn the trash. So he has big trash burnings, and he really likes the fire. At noon, we are introduced to Larry Crockett. He is the real estate mogul who lives in town, and he kind of works in a crappy little office, and he is reminiscing about how about a year ago he sold the Marston House and a laundromat, an old defunct laundromat, to a man named Richard Straker. And this guy bought the laundromat and the house, for $1 in some very shady business dealing. There was blackmailing. He had information on Larry Crockett that even his wife didn't know about. So there was like an underhanded theme to it. And despite the number of times I have read this book, I still don't exactly understand what the deal they made was. But anyway, apparently it was like a win-win deal, and Straker, he bought the laundromat to turn into a secondhand, an antique store kind of thing to run with his partner Kurt Barlow, and they were going to live in the Marston House. So that's why he bought it, and his request for this deal is that Larry doesn't talk about it to anyone, and that if he needs certain favors, certain odd jobs done, that Larry will provide these services for him without any questions asked. And then at this moment, because we're at the noon hour, Larry's going to lunch, and he sees that the car is up at the Marston House. So Straker is at the Marston House at this time. So then we're introduced to some other people. There's Bonnie Sawyer and Corey Bryant. They are having an affair. Charlie Rhodes, he's the bus driver. Sandy McDougal, she has a baby Randy that she abuses, and she has a husband, Royce. I believe she got pregnant at a very young age, and Royce married her and they probably shouldn't have gotten married, and she resents this baby, and that's a whole issue that will come up. 4:00 p.m. we see that Ben is in his boarding house room. He's getting ready for dinner at Susan's house. He's going to meet her parents. And he notices a car at the Marston House. And he's talking about the Marston House on page 101. It says, quote, "From here it was a perfect miniature, diminished to the size of a child's dollhouse. And he liked it that way. From here the Marston House was a size that could be coped with. You could hold up your hand and blot it out with your palm." At 5 p.m. we meet Matthew Burke. He is a teacher, and I always get confused because his name is Jason in the movie. His name is Matt in the book. I don't know why they couldn't have kept his name as Matt. He's a teacher, and quote, "His fingers were permanently yellowed with chalk dust rather than nicotine, but it was still the residue of an addicting substance." And that's on page 103. So Matt Burke also sees the car parked in the Marston driveway. So everyone is just noticing because there hasn't been a car there in so long. Now there is one. Everyone is paying attention to it. And he even says, quote, "He had been teaching in Salem's lot since 1952, and he had never seen a car parked in that driveway." That's on page 104. At 6:00, Ben has dinner at Susan's house, and he meets her parents, Bill and Ann Norton. Susan is worried that her parents won't like him, but her dad seems to take an instant liking to Ben. And I love this description. It says, quote, "An odd communication seemed to pass between the two women who bore strong resemblance to each other. Ann Norton's brow contracted while Susan's smoothed out. A load of worry seemed to have been transferred across the room by telepathy," on page 106. And I just really like that because Anne, I think, was counting on her husband being an ally and not liking Ben. And then she was very concerned because he took immediately to Ben. So it was 2-1, not in her favor, because Susan and her father, Bill, like Ben, and Anne is now the only one who doesn't like him. 7:30 p.m., Danny and Ralphie Glick take a very creepy, chilling walk through the woods. They're walking to Mark Petrie's house to go see his monster collection, and they took a back road, like through the woods shortcut, and they hear noises and they see glowing eyes, and it's very, very spooky. At 9 p.m. we meet Mabel Wirtz. She's 74 years old, and she pretty much spends her entire time sitting, spying in the town with her binoculars and calling people or listening on the party line to people talk about stuff. And she is, quote, "a repository of town history and town gossip, and her memory stretched back over 5 decades of necrology, adultery, thievery, and insanity." That's on page 117. And also on page 117, quote, "She simply lived in and for the town. In a way, she was the town." So there's this dark figure standing at the Harmony Hill Cemetery, waiting until it turns midnight. And he speaks out loud, saying, quote, "O my Father, favor me now. Lord of flies, favor me now. Now I bring you spoiled meat and reeking flesh. I have made sacrifice for your favor. With my left hand I bring it. Make a sign for me on this ground, consecrated in your name. I wait for a sign to begin your work." And then there's a little bit more, and then it says, "There was no sound, but that brought on the breeze." The figure stood silent and thoughtful for a time. Then it stooped and stood with the figure of a child in his arms. "I bring you this." It became unspeakable. So, a little human sacrifice there. Maybe a child-sized human sacrifice. And then next we have chapter 4, which is titled Danny Glick and Others. So Ralphie is missing, and there's a huge multi-day search party. Danny get the brother, the one who came back from the woods. He's sick and he's admitted to the hospital. Straker calls and asks Larry Crockett to have people pick up some boxes for the store and the house at a shipping dock, and Larry Crockett sends Hank Peters and Royal Snow, and they are supposed to go and get these boxes. They're going to bring everything to the store except for one box. It's a really huge, big, creepy box, and they take it to the store and they're supposed to lock it with a padlock, and then they take the big box to the house, and it's supposed to go down in the cellar, and then they're supposed to leave all the keys to 5 padlocks on the table downstairs in the cellar, and then padlock the front door, the back door, the shed, and I think the cellar door, and then of course the one that was in town in the shop. So they arrive at the house and it's dark. They did the store first. They arrive at the house and it's dark, and they're kind of creeped out because, the Marston House is the spooky haunted house of the town, and they are so afraid they don't want to unload the box in the cellar. So there's a great quote. It says, "But childhood was beyond them, and they were incapable of going back with the job undone because of irrational fear. How would they explain it in bright daylight?" That's on page 139 to 140. So they get the box downstairs, and they're both really keyed up, really freaked out, and they realize they didn't put the keys down there. So they flip a coin to see who has to go down, and Hank loses. So he goes down there, and as he's walking through the cellar, he notices a kid's shirt and jeans and a shoe. And he remembers that that's pretty much what Ralphie Glick was wearing when he disappeared. So he throws the keys on the table and he books it, and they go back to Larry and they get paid for their job and whatnot. And then Hank kind of hangs back and talks to Larry, and he tells him what he saw. And Larry, who is supposed to, in essence, protect Straker and Barlow, he kind of gently persuades / blackmails Hank into doubting what he saw, pretty much saying, well, you didn't see a body, and a whole bunch of unsavory things could come out if you go to the police with this. So at this point, Ralphie has been missing for more than a week. Parkins Gillespie goes to talk to Ben Mears, and he goes to talk to Straker because they are new in town and he's a little suspicious and needs to check them out. And at the very end of this chapter, Danny Glick is found dead in his hospital room. 12-year-old boy, just dead. And his brother is still missing. They don't know what happened to him, but they're pretty sure he must be dead at this point. So now we are at chapter 5, which is Ben 2. Ben has found out that 4 children disappeared from 1928 to 1939, which is while Hubie and Bertie lived in the Marston House. And he's talking to Susan, and he says, quote, "I think that house might be Hubert Marsden's monument to evil, a kind of psychic sounding board, a supernatural beacon, if you like." That's on page 176. And he's worried that this evil house might either cause possession in people who experience it, or it could not lure, but it could attract evil people, and that scares him more than the idea of possession. So Ben goes out to Dell's Tavern that night on the outskirts of town, and that's where he meets Weasel Craig, and he knows him from the boarding house. He ends up sitting with him, and then Matt Burke comes in, and he knows Weasel, so the 3 of them are hanging out together. And Matt and Ben are talking about his latest book, and Matt asks if he is writing about the Marston House because town gossip kind of says so. And there's a little thing, Ben has a thought. Quote, "Ben suddenly had an uncomfortable image. Here is a fish swimming around comfortably and, he thinks, unobtrusively, flicking here and there amongst the kelp and the plankton. Draw away for the long view, and there's the kicker. It's a goldfish bowl." That's on page 185. So Ben thought that he was being so secretive and playing it close to the chest, and all this gossip is still going around. It kind of freaks him out because he thought he had been undetected. Chapter 6, The Lot 2. So the 28th of September, Danny Glick is buried in Harmony Hill Cemetery, and Father Donald Callahan presides over the service, and this is our first introduction to him. During the funeral, Tony Glick, the dad, jumps into the grave, and he has to be hauled out by a whole bunch of men, which is scandalous, and Mabel Wirtz is watching that, and she's kind of excited. After the funeral, Mike Ryerson fills in the grave, and as he's doing it, he feels like he's being watched by Danny. So he opens the coffin, and, quote, "The eyes were open, just as he had known they would be, wide open and hardly glazed at all. They seemed to sparkle with hideous life in the last dying light of day." It's on page 209. And then the sun sets, and we don't exactly know what happened, but yet we do know what happened because vampires. The FBI calls Perkins Gillespie and gives him a rundown on Ben Mears, Kurt Barlow, and Richard Straker. So Ben Mears, the only thing about him is he's been in some protests, and he was investigated for a motorcycle accident that killed his wife, Miranda, in 1973 in New York. So now we know a little more about what happened with Ben's wife. Kurt Barlow, it was German-born. He fled to England in 1938. There's no birth date on record for him. Interesting. And the FBI agent said he's probably in his 70s. And then R.T. Straker is British-born, and he's 58 years old. Dud Rogers meets Barlow in the dump. Barlow has been... People keep saying that he is on a buying trip. He's not in town. So Dud actually meets him in the dump. He's come and watched the fire. He talks to Dud a little bit, and then he bites Dud, turns him into a vampire. Father Callahan, we go back to him. He has become a drunk over his last few years, and there is a quote. Here we go. On page 229. "You could educate your hand not to be aware of the bottle's lessening weight." So his was like a gradual drinking too much. And he kind of struggles with his role in the world. He wants to fight real evil without any of the kind of bureaucratic political attachments to the issues. So that's his big thing. He wants to fight evil. Chapter 7 is Matt. And this is the last chapter we're going to cover in this segment. So Ben and Matt have dinner at Matt's house, and they're discussing how they should take Susan, and the three of them should go up to the Marston House as like a welcoming party and investigate the new neighbors kind of thing. And then Matt goes out to Dell's, the little bar, and he runs into Mike Ryerson, and he thinks that Mike is on heavy drugs because Mike just looks awful. And Mike says that he got sick after the funeral, and he doesn't even remember filling in Danny's grave, and he doesn't know what's wrong with him. It's not drugs. And so Mike is just beside himself, and Matt invites him to his house to sleep, and then he's going to take him to the doctor the next day. So in the middle of the night, Matt hears Mike invite something into his house, and Matt is too afraid to go check and see what it is. Quote, "And in the awful heavy silence of the house, as he sat impotently on his bed with his face in his hands, he heard the high, sweet, evil laugh of a child, and then the sucking sounds." That's on page 254. We are on part 2 now. This is part 2, The Emperor of Ice Cream. And it opens up with a poem written by Wallace Stevens called The Emperor of Ice Cream. And it's a poem about death. It's, I think, a good poem, but it might be a little pretentious. So the first chapter in part 2 is chapter 8, which is Ben 3. So Eva wakes Ben up in the middle of the night to take a phone call from Matt. And when we last heard from Matt, he was sitting on his bed, afraid to go check in on Mike Ryerson. So he asks Ben to come over and to bring a crucifix, which Ben is able to borrow from Eva because her husband had one, her late husband. And, quote, he could not hold the crucifix and dig for his car keys at the same time, and instead of simply transferring it from his right hand to his left, he slipped it over his neck. The silver slipped comfortably against his shirt, and getting into the car, he was hardly aware that he felt comforted, on page 259. Ben gets over to Matt's house, and Matt tells him everything. He tells him that he's afraid that Mike has been bitten by a vampire. He's afraid that a vampire was able to enter his house because Mike invited it inside. He is just terrified, and Mike is dead, and he's laying in this guest bedroom. And I love this quote from Matt on page 261. He says, "I'm talking nonsense and I'm thinking madness." And I really like that. I'm talking nonsense and I'm thinking madness. I'm sure we can all relate to that. So Mike looks alive and healthy, just like he's sleeping comfortably in the bed, but he doesn't have a pulse and he's not breathing. So Matt and Ben decide that the best course of action is to not say anything other than, this guy is dead, please come check it out. So they call the constable, Perkins Gillespie, and they call Matt's doctor, Jimmy Cody. And Jimmy Cody is the doctor that Matt was going to take Mike to anyway the next day because Mike was so sick. So they come and they inspect him. He is indeed dead, and everyone's kind of disturbed by the fact that he doesn't look dead. He just looks like he's peacefully sleeping. They cart him off, and it says, quote, "Carl Foreman's funeral wagon had come and taken Mike Ryerson's body away, and the fact of his passing left the house with him and belonged to the town," on page 277. So Ben is all worn out. He is exhausted. He's been up all night with Matt, discussing what to do, what not to do, and Floyd Tibbetts beats him up in the parking lot of Eva's boarding house. So chapter 9 is Susan 2. Susan fights with her mother. I guess she and her mother have had years and years of fighting over boys, and Anne gets under Susan's skin a lot of the time, but it's starting to lose its efficacy. She doesn't care as much about her mom, and she sees her in a different light, kind of like she realizes that her mom's just hurting her, just trying to bait her, and she's just sick of buying into it, so she has decided that she's going to move out. I think the final straw was probably when Anne was talking about how Ben was complicit in his wife's death, and implying that he is a bad guy, and just intentionally trying to ruin Susan's image of Ben and try to turn her against him. So in the middle of this fight between Susan and Anne, Eva calls to tell Susan that Ben has been beaten up and is at the hospital. So Susan kind of digs at her mother by saying, this guy you like so much, this Floyd Tibbetts, has put Ben in the hospital, so yay for you. So Susan goes to visit Ben, and he's sedated, but he tells her to go meet up with Matt and to ask him if he knows Father Callahan, the Catholic priest. He also tells her to lock the windows. He tells her that a few times, and then he succumbs to the sedation. So Susan goes to Matt's house, and remember, this is the night that they were supposed to have that welcoming party, and the three of them were going to go up to the Marston House and meet Straker and Barlow and investigate them. So Susan goes to Matt's house. She tells him her impressions of Straker because she went to the opening of his antique shop. And she thinks that he was condescending and a little cruel, but he was very sly about it, these were all just things that she was inferring from his behavior. And they start talking about the Marston House, because everything goes back to the Marston House. And Susan says, quote, "Houses are only houses. Evil dies with the perpetration of evil acts." And that's on page 302. So while Susan and Matt are conversing about the Marston House, it then comes out what happened with Mike Ryerson, and as Matt is telling his story, he keeps pausing because he keeps hearing noises from upstairs. And finally, he decides that there is someone up there, and he tells Susan that he has to go upstairs because he's freaked out. And he opens the guest bedroom, which he had left open, but now it's shut. He opens the bedroom door, and Mike Ryerson is laying in the bed, and he has silver eyes that are rimmed in red, and Matt can see the autopsy stitches, so like across the chest and down into like a Y, so like into the torso. And he has canines that are white and sharp. So this whole thing where, if you've seen the movie, is one of my favorites, where Matt revokes his invitation and he has this confrontation with Mike, and Mike falls out of the window and he threatens that he's going to see him sleep like the dead, and this is all too much for Matt, and he has a heart attack and he collapses in the hallway, and Susan runs up to him and she ends up calling Jimmy Cody to come save Matt. And Susan heard the voice say, "I'll see you sleep like the dead, teacher." And while she's waiting for the doctor, she finds a class ring in front of the open window of the guest room, and she bends down and picks it up, and it has the initials of Mike Ryerson. Quote, "For a moment, in the dark, she believed it all. A scream rose in her throat and she choked it unvoiced, but the ring tumbled from her fingers and lay on the floor below the window, glinting in the moonlight that rode the autumn dark." It's on page 311. Chapter 10 is the Lot 3. So we're told about a whole bunch of town secrets, which are really, I love that Stephen King puts these little details in. They're so fulfilling. I don't know. There have been people who have murdered other people. There was a guy who everyone knew that his wife left town with a traveling salesman, but what they don't know is that she left with the traveling salesman. The salesman dumped her, and when she returned to her husband, he killed her, and he threw her body into the well on their property. So her skeleton is still down there, and everyone thinks that she just ran away with this traveling salesman. So just little things like that. There was another woman who had won a whole bunch of money in an insurance settlement, I think it was, and she put it in between the wall and the wallpaper of her house, and now she's old and senile and doesn't remember that that money is even there in the house. So there's just all these little things that I like, little details. We find out that Sandy McDougal's son, so she's the one who is abusive toward her baby, her son Randy, has been killed by Danny Glick. And it said that, Danny Glick had sucked his blood and then basically threw the kid into the crib like a rag doll when he was done with it. But what always bothered me about this is, how did Danny Glick get into this bedroom? Because we've heard already in here that you need to have an invitation in order to get into someone's house. So how did the baby invite Danny Glick? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. I still like the imagery, and I love that Stephen King does not hesitate to write off children. So anyway, Sandy McDougal finds Randy dead in his crib, and we'll just ignore the fact that I don't know how that could happen. Marjorie Glick, which is Danny's mom, she's been having dreams about visits from Danny, and he's been sucking her blood. Floyd dies in the police drunk tank, and Reggie Sawyer catches Bonnie Sawyer, his wife, and Corey having an affair. I mentioned them a couple videos ago. And this was always a really tense scene in the movie, and it's no less tense in the book, but basically Reggie marches Corey out of the bedroom, and he scares him with a shotgun. He makes Corey think that he's going to be shot, and Corey, he loses it, and the gun was empty. So he tells Corey to leave town and never come back. So in the middle of the night, Corey's on his way to just, leave town, and he's going to wire for his savings to live off of. And he meets Barlow. Corey and Barlow are talking on the side of the road, and Barlow tells us on page 353, quote, "So I have come here to a town which was first told of to me by a most brilliant man, a former townsman himself, now lamentably deceased." And that person would have been Hubie Marston. It doesn't say it, but I'm positive that's who it is. So before Hubie Marston died, he had been in correspondence with Barlow. And Barlow turns Corey into a vampire. At the morgue attendants find the bodies of Floyd Tibbetts and Randy McDougal, the baby, are missing. And their little locker doors are left open, just standing open. And no one saw anyone go in or out. They have no idea how it happened. And then we get to one of my favorite scenes of all time. And this is when Danny Glick visits Mark, and he's kind of hanging outside of the second story window. And the imagery in the movie is phenomenal. But Danny is just kind of hanging out there, and he tells Mark that he's finally here to see the monsters that he was on his way to see. Because remember, when Danny and Ralphie were accosted, they were on their way to Mark's house. And in the movie, they actually go to Mark's house, and it's on the way back that they get taken and or damaged. So, quote, "The pallid face outside the window tried to smile, but it had lain in darkness too long to remember precisely how. What Mark saw was a twitching grimace, a bloody mask of tragedy." That's on page 359. So, Mark is a very smart kid, and he invites Danny in. So Danny is excited because he's got another victim. So he invites Danny in, and he pulls a cross off of one of his little monster tableaus, and he swings it around and burns Danny's cheek with it. And then that sends he touches Danny's cheek with it, and that sends Danny into a rage, and he's furious, and he gets sent back out through the window. So then on page 363, we get a very good description of adult terror versus child terror. So basically, Mark is thinking about all the different things that the adults worry about in life. Like, does my wife still love me? Are my friends true friends? Etc., etc. And then it says, quote, "There is no group therapy or psychiatry or community social services for the child who must cope with the thing under the bed or in the cellar every night, the thing which leers and capers and threatens just beyond the point where vision will reach. The same lonely battle must be fought night after night, and the only cure is the eventual ossification of the imaginary faculties, and this is called adulthood." In some shorter, simpler mental shorthand, these thoughts passed through his brain. The night before, Matt Burke had faced such a dark thing and had been stricken by a heart seizure brought on by fright. Tonight, Mark Petrie had faced one, and 10 minutes later lay in the lap of sleep, the plastic cross still grasped loosely in his right hand like a child's rattle. Such is the difference between men and boys. So I really like that, because there is some sort of point where things that terrify you, you just stop believing in them. Like if it's your imagination eventually slows down, and you disregard a lot of stuff that had originally worried you or freaked you out. And so I really like the way that Stephen King put that in here. I really like the fact that you have Mark, who faced off with a vampire and, beat the vampire, and then he just kind of lays back down and calms himself down, and he's fine. But you had Matt, who was so scared because he had, his rational mind couldn't take it, and he had a heart attack, and they both won, but it was just, I like the difference between Mark and Matt facing off with vampires. Today is part 4 of the Stephen King Sematary Club's discussion of Salem's Lot. Now, today we will cover chapter 11, which is Ben 4, and we will go through chapter 13, which is Father Callahan. Matt is in the hospital because of his heart attack, and Ben is also in the hospital because he got beaten up by Floyd Tibbets, and he had a head injury. So Susan goes to visit, and they all are talking in Matt's room, and the doctor comes in, Jimmy Cody. They ask to speak to him after his rounds, so he's gonna look at Matt, then he's gonna go meet up with Ben and Susan, and they're gonna discuss things. So they're gonna tell Jimmy everything. So they talk to him about exhuming the body of Danny Glick, and Jimmy agrees, because logically he's thinking that, if there is nothing to worry about, then it will just be a dead body, but if there is something, then better to know. So he has agreed, but they are still going to talk to the Glicks to get permission to exhume the body. Ben and Jimmy go to the Glick's house, and they find out that Marjorie, the mother, is dead, and Tony, the dad, has been taken to the hospital. He's in shock because, in just a few weeks, both of his children have died. Well, one is technically missing, but both of his children are pretty much dead, and now his wife is dead. So I can imagine that he is going through some stuff. So Ben is thinking, quote, "Things were going very fast now, too fast to suit him. Fantasy and reality had merged." And I feel like that's a very apt description of just the rest of this book. Like, this book is such a roller coaster at the end. It's just constant action, and all this crazy stuff happens, and it keeps your interest. And even though Stephen King writes in these little sub-chapters, you devour them and keep going. So Stephen King books are great because you can read just small sections at a time. You don't have to wait for very long to get to like a page break or, a change of scenery or character or something like that. So it's effective in that it keeps you interested, and it makes you not care that they're short because you just keep reading them anyway. So they might as well be long. Does that make sense? Marjorie Glick has been taken to Maury Green's mortuary, and Jimmy had saved the life of Maury Green's son way back in the day, and so he's going to cash in on a favor from Maury. So they go there and they ask if they can sit with Marjorie Glick's corpse. So now we cut away from Ben and Jimmy, and we see that Susan has decided to go to the Marston House on her own. So she drives out there. On the way, she sees a snow fence and takes one of those picket fence pieces as her stake because she is going to fight this vampire. And she also stops at a little store and buys a crucifix. So she parks, goes through the woods up toward the house. She even thinks, as she's going, that she always thought girls in movies who went to investigate noises or went to do things like this were really dumb, and she would never do it. And here she is doing it. So Susan is aware of the trope of the girl going to investigate, or the girl putting herself in a dangerous situation, and here she is doing the exact thing that she says she wouldn't do. So I guess at least she's aware of it. But she is really nervous, really freaked out. She feels something isn't normal, and so she's crawling up the side of the house in the woods, and she kind of chides herself, and she says, quote, "From the front yard you can see your own house. Now what in God's name could happen to you in sight of your own house?" That's on page 388 to 389. So at this moment, Straker leaves. So he takes his car, and she sees him go and turn off into town. So she knows that he's not at the house anymore. And then we flip back to Ben and Jimmy. And Maury hands the keys over to Jimmy. You know, he agrees to let them stay up with Mrs. Glick. And Maury says, quote, "If she says anything, write it down for posterity." He began to chuckle, saw the identical look on their faces, and stopped. That's on page 393. So, poor Maury, he's gotten himself into this. And while Jimmy and Ben are at the mortuary, Jimmy kind of does like an examination of Mrs. Glick. She's very dead. She doesn't look so dead, but she is dead. And a little bit after sunset, she rises, and it's so beautifully described. Like, the sheet that's covering her twitches, and you can see her hand fall out from under the sheet and start wriggling. And there's a huge fight between Marjorie, Ben, and Jimmy. Ben is trying to stave Marjorie off with a tongue depressor cross that he fashioned and then blessed by praying over it. And Jimmy kind of circles around behind to try and grab her. And when he grabs her, she throws him across the room, and he crashes into a whole bunch of stuff. And she's very strong, and she's on him, like, I think they described like a spider. So she's quickly on him, and she's biting him. So, quote, "Jimmy Cody screamed, the high, despairing scream of the utterly damned." That's on page 398. So, you know, it's really concerning that Jimmy has been bitten and Marjorie is still going after him. So on page 399, let me find it. Okay. Ben is trying to help. So he approaches Marjorie and, quote, "He grabbed her by the collar of her housecoat and yanked her upward, forgetting the cross momentarily. Her head came around with frightening swiftness. Her eyes were dilated and glittering, her lips and chin slicked with blood that was black in this near-total darkness. Her breath in his face was foul beyond measure, the breath of tombs. As if in slow motion, he could see her tongue lick across her teeth. He brought the cross up just as she jerked him forward into her embrace, her strength making him feel like something made of rags. The rounded point of the tongue depressor that formed the cross's downstroke struck her under the chin and then continued upward with no fleshy resistance. Ben's eyes were stunned by a flash of non-light that happened not before his eyes, but seemingly behind them. There was the hot and porcine smell of burning flesh. Her scream this time was full-throated and agonized. He sensed rather than saw her throw herself backwards, stumble over the television and fall on the floor, one white arm thrown outward to break her fall. She was up again with wolf-like agility, her eyes narrowed in pain, yet still filled with her insane hunger. The flesh of her lower jaw was smoking and black. She was snarling at him. So this continues, and he corners her, and then he's gonna jab the cross right on her face, but she kind of dissipates into like a foggy mist type thing. So I always loved this scene, and I really enjoy what they do in the movie, but I feel like they could have done more in the movie. So after Marjorie Glick has vanished, Jimmy is freaking out because he's been bitten. He's got blood, running down his neck, and he felt something when he saw the cross. He felt like angry and just he was becoming a vampire or whatever. He can feel her poison or whatever working in his blood, and he gets Ben to give him a tetanus shot in his armpit, and he upends a whole bunch of some sort of disinfectant, so probably some sort of alcohol, into this gaping wound where there are mangled teeth marks. So Jimmy doctors himself, and it's really interesting because I always think, when someone gets, I guess it depends on the lore, but if someone gets bit by a vampire, usually they're just finished. So that was always really cool that Jimmy was able to disinfect the wounds and save himself. So he makes it. He and Ben decide that they have to come up with a story so that they won't get in trouble, Maury won't get in trouble, whatever. And they decide to just kind of make it whoever's doing the body snatching, they're going to kind of leave it vague enough and open-ended so that the police will think that whoever's been snatching all these bodies is the person who broke in and stole Mrs. Glick's body. So the police come and, they tell them someone broke in, stole the body. Poor Maury Green is standing there like, I know you guys are lying, but I don't know why you're lying. This is very awkward. And when Ben finally gets back to his room, quote, he slept the rest of the night with the desk lamp on and left the tongue depressor cross that had vanquished Mrs. Glick on the table by his right hand, on page 410. And then we are on chapter 12, which is Mark. So Mark had also been out in the woods by the Marston House, and he saw Susan approaching the house. Quote, he decided they had to team up. Anything would be better than going up to that house alone, on page 414. So the two of them briefly chat. Susan mentions to him that, there are some people in town who suspect that there might be vampires in the lot, and she's there to take care of things, which I don't know why she just didn't wait. But anyway, the two of them break into the house together through a window, and it's dusty, smelly, and really disorderly. Mark even finds a book that has a photo in it of a naked man holding a disemboweled child out to something. He's like offering it as a sacrifice. So they proceed to the kitchen and decide that they're going to go down into the cellar because Mark is convinced that's where Barlow would be. So as they're ready to head down, Stryker ambushes them from behind. So he takes Susan down to the cellar and he takes Mark upstairs to where Hubie Marston killed himself. Stryker ties Mark up. Mark had been reading about Houdini and how he used to get out of being tied up. So he implements this trick, and when he's getting tied up, he puffs out all of his muscles and he holds his breath and puffs his chest out and all that stuff, and he manages to free himself after. It's quite a lengthy description, but it's really interesting how Mark gets himself free from these ropes. So Mark frees himself pretty much just before sunset, and right after he gets free, he tries the window, sees that it's nailed shut so he can't get out, and he hears Stryker's footsteps coming up the stairs. So he goes over to this iron cot frame that's in the room with him, and he unscrews a leg. And as soon as Stryker opens the door and is kind of stunned because Mark is no longer tied up where he left him, Mark whacks him over the head with this iron cot leg and pretty much knocks Stryker out, smashes him a few more times, and kills him. So he goes down to the cellar door, and it's dark, and he manages to step a little bit down, like 1 or 2 steps down into the cellar, and quote, to go back down into that cellar and try to save Susan meant induction into the ranks of the undead. That's page 435. So he yells for Susan to run, and Susan answers him, but in like a dazed, kind of disoriented voice, and all of a sudden there's a big noise, and it's presumably Barlow who has woken up, and Susan screams. Barlow calls up to Mark, tries to get him to come down, and Mark runs away. So that night, Susan visits Mark outside of his window, just like Danny Glick had done, and begs him to let her in, and he doesn't. He puts his little cross up against the window, and she, freaks out and goes away. So he decides that he has to go in search of Ben, because he's seen Ben and Susan around, and he figures that's probably the most likely person who would know about the vampires. So then, as he's heading to bed, he worries that, maybe Susan has already visited Ben. So chapter 13 is Father Callahan, and Father Callahan has visited Matt in the hospital. Matt has accumulated a huge assortment of books about vampires, and he is going to talk to Father Callahan about vampires being in the lot. So he asks him, have you noticed anything weird around here? I think some things are going on, and he tells Father Callahan everything. So I find Callahan to be a very likable character, and he's very knowledgeable, he's very multidimensional, he has flaws, which I appreciate. He's very intelligent, and I think he's a great addition to their little vampire hunting circle. And after everything is explained to him, he agrees that he's going to help them out, and he suggests that they meet with Straker so that Straker can say, you guys are weird, I am a normal dude, please leave me alone now. And Father Callahan has a sense of, purpose, I guess, because remember, he wanted to fight evil. That was, his thing. He wanted to fight real evil, and, this is kind of his chance. So as he leaves the hospital, and he's got this mission, I guess, to go on, he feels kind of exhilarated and full of life. He's not very worried. But then, all of a sudden, he has this terrible sense of dread that just engulfs him. And, quote, the terror he felt was for his immortal soul. That's on page 456. We have our vampire hunters now. We've got Matt and Ben, Mark, Father Callahan, and Susan. And they're all good in their own way. Susan, I think, is an idiot for having gone up to the house on her own. I don't understand why she wouldn't just wait. Even if she didn't fully believe the story, there are enough coincidences and occurrences that would give me pause, where I would not just march up to that house and investigate. It really bothers me. I find all of them to be very likable. Even Susan. She's just a little trying sometimes, but Father Callahan, I really enjoy Father Callahan's part in this story, and I'm very excited to tell you that he appears in another book, which makes me happy. Because I think at one point I had heard that Stephen King had considered writing something about Father Callahan, but then he ended up not doing it. There was going to be some sort of sequel to Salem's Lot, but then he ended up just making Father Callahan a character in one of the Dark Tower books. So I really would have been interested in a sequel. Maybe it's better, because it is my favorite, so maybe it's better that there was no sequel. Hi guys, we are at the final discussion of Salem's Lot. We are on part 3, which is called The Deserted Village, and one of the things in here is an excerpt from the Edgar Allan Poe poem, The Haunted Palace. And travelers now within that valley through the red litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a rapid, ghastly river through the pale door, a hideous throng rush out forever and laugh, but smile no more. I really like that poem about insanity. So we move on to chapter 14, which is The Lot 4. And we have an excerpt from the Old Farmer's Almanac. It says, quote, the moon was new. The day's verse from the old farmer was, see last sun, harvest's nigh done. That's on page 459. And I always took that to mean human harvest. Like, the vampires are harvesting humans. So it's kind of a creepy little thought. That's what I always took from that. So on page 460, it says, quote, "No one pronounced Jerusalem's lot dead on the morning of October 6th. No one knew it was. Like the bodies of previous days, it retained every semblance of life." End quote. So we find out that Susan is visiting her mom and siphoning blood off of her. Lots of random people are kind of under the radar missing. Like, people are aware that people are missing, but they're not overly concerned. Like Larry Crockett, his daughter, he hasn't seen her, but he assumes that she just got up and went to school, that kind of thing. Or people feel sick, they feel run down and tired, and they just don't want to mess with looking for other people. So Mark meets Ben, and he tells him about Susan and about Straker. And Ben is very upset by this. He takes Mark over to Matt's hospital room, and that's when we get I would say the core group of vampire hunters: Ben, Matt, Mark, and Jimmy. So they discuss preparations that Straker made for Barlow's arrival, because Matt has been like kind of researching everything and trying to figure out vampire lore and all that stuff. So killing and sacrificing Ralphie Glick was the beginning, and bleeding out Danny. And then the very first preparation was killing Doc, that Cocker Spaniel dog, because he had white patches over his eyes. And apparently a way to scare vampires away was to get a black dog and paint little white spots over his eyes. So that dog already had it naturally. Straker must have run across the dog and then killed it, because why take chances? Father Callahan hears the confessions of all of them. They grab holy water, they buy a ton of garlic, and they attempt to buy white roses, which Straker has already purchased all of them in town. And they go onward to the Marston House, where they find Straker hanging upside down. His throat has been ravaged, and he's been bled white. And in the cellar, Barlow has left them a letter. A whole bunch of mean things in there. He also said that he left a present for Ben. The present that Barlow has for Ben is Susan. And this scene is very, very bloody, very emotional, and Ben is traumatized. He is the person who is supposed to stake Susan because they had sexual relations, and he must treat her as though they were married, and he is the wronged party, and it's up to him. And just some of the description in it is heart-wrenching. In the letter that Barlow left, he threatened Mark's parents. So Jimmy and Ben go back to Matt's hospital room. Mark and Father Callahan go to the Petrie's house and try to warn them about the vampires. And they do not believe. So in the middle of trying to get them to go meet the others at the hospital, Barlow enters the house, which, again, does he not need an invitation? Is he, being the supreme alpha vampire, does he just get to come and go as he pleases? Or is that a continuity error? I'm not sure. But he faces off with Father Callahan after, he's killed Mark's parents. And in the movie, it's quite an interesting scene. We'll get to that in my review of the movie. So Father Callahan is facing off with Barlow, and Mark escapes. Father Callahan says, get away, run away. Barlow invites the priest to throw away his crucifix and to just face him mano a mano, and Father Callahan doesn't. He's thinking, like, should I do this? If I don't do it, is that saying something about my faith? Is that putting me at a disadvantage? Etc., etc. And as he's thinking all this, Barlow approaches him and takes the crucifix from him, breaks the arms of the cross, and throws it on the ground. And he has lost. He has lost everything. And Barlow slices his own throat to produce gushing blood, and he holds Father Callahan against his throat, suffocating him until Father Callahan drinks. So he doesn't turn into a vampire, but he is marked and mentally tormented. As Callahan is walking toward his church in the middle of the night after this incident, quote, "No vampires would touch him, others perhaps, but not him. The master had marked him, and he would walk free until the master claimed his own." That's on page 534. So when Father Callahan tries to seek solace in his church, he tries to open the doors, and a kind of like a lightning charge happens, and he is zapped, and his hand is burned, and he is denied access to his church. He is unclean, impure. He is screwed. So he decides to go leave town. Matt says something that really always stuck with me. Quote, "There is every possibility that some of us, or all of us, may live and triumph only to stand trial for murder." A thing that I really like in the book that I really wish had been in the movie was Charlie Rhodes, the kind of cranky, mean bus driver. He is awakened from a deep slumber by his bus horn being blared, and he goes out really mad. He's certain that it's the kids misbehaving and he's going to teach them a lesson, and I think he grabs a tennis racket and he gets on the bus, and then the kid who's in the driver's seat pulls the door shut, and he finds that there are a whole bunch of vampire children on the bus, which would have been an amazing scene. Danny Glick is even in there, and it's said that he doesn't even ride the bus, and he has been dead for weeks. So the order of business is to make steaks at the Petri house using the lathe, and Jimmy and Ben are kind of realizing the phenomenal job that they have undertaken. And Jimmy says to Ben, quote, "It's going to be weeks before we get them all, if we ever do. Can you stand that? Can you stand doing what you did to Susan 1,000 times?" That's on page 568. And that's a really good point, because if they have to continuously kill vampires and worry about getting caught doing it, and worry about, just the bloodiness, the toll it takes on your mental faculties, just all that stuff is very inundating, and I could see why people would just quit and leave. That's in fact what Constable Gillespie does. He just decides he is finished. It's not worth it to him. He's taken off. He is not going to stay around. So Matt dies in the hospital. Jimmy and Mark go exploring and looking for vampires while Ben makes steaks, and Jimmy and Mark are going to map out where people are, where they're hiding, so that they can easily go back and find them again. They piece together that the vampires are kind of nesting at Eva's boarding house, and that's where Barlow is being kept. So they go to Eva's house, her boarding house, and the cellar light is broken. It doesn't work. And Jimmy kind of heads down to explore. Quote, "There was a rattling noise followed by a heavy thump. The cellar door stood open, and the screams began." It's on page 583. So there was a trap, and I love, they kind of used the imagery in the movie, but not to great effect, and not to this effect. They changed it quite a bit. But what it was is the vampires sawed off the stairs of the cellar after the second step, and they moved them away. They left the rail going down a little bit further to give an illusion that there were full stairs in the dark, and they took all the kitchen knives. They stuck them through pieces of plywood and then removed the handles. And then they left the knives positioned upward on the cellar floor so that someone would walk down the stairs, fall, and then land on the knives. That is how Jimmy dies. He gets impaled with a whole bunch of knives, and he bleeds out. And Mark, he fashions a wooden beam so that he can climb out of the cellar. So he runs into Ben, who's on his way back to town. They go back to the boarding house, into the cellar. They drag the coffin out from the root cellar, and scattered all about are vampire bodies. So it's like a little vampire nest, and Barlow's at the center in his coffin. So they haul the coffin out into the cellar proper and open up the coffin. Mark looks at Barlow, which he had earlier said don't look in his eyes, but he looked in the eyes, and he is overcome with this mad desire to stop Ben, to kill Ben, to protect Barlow. So Ben is trying to stake Barlow, but also trying to fight Mark, and he ends up fighting Mark off, and then he has several things go wrong. He drops a stake. He realizes he left the hammer over by the lock on the root cellar door, so he has to go and retrieve the hammer. And so anyway, he finally climbs into the coffin and starts hammering the stake into Barlow, and he pins him down by the legs. So he is finally staked. The other vampires wake up and are kind of lost. Why did you kill our master? What's going on? How dare you? They're in shock. So Mark and Ben escape, and they leave Salem's Lot. So that's the end of that. So now we are on chapter 15, Ben and Mark. Ben and Mark check into a motel outside of town, and the next day Ben returns to Salem's Lot. He goes to the boarding house, goes into his room, he burns his manuscript, and then he takes that snow globe that he took from the Marston House, and he throws it against the wall, and he leaves. He grabs Jimmy's body from the cellar, and he looks in the coffin and sees that there is the stake and then Barlow's teeth, and that's it. He picks the teeth up and they start moving. It's really creepy, and so he freaks out and drops them. So Ben single-handedly buries Jimmy and Mark's parents. And then as he is ready to leave town, quote, "The town was dead. All at once he knew it for sure and true, just as he had known for sure that Miranda was dead when he had seen her shoe lying in the road. He began to cry." On page 619. And then he leaves Salem's Lot, and that's the point where he takes Mark and they just go to Mexico, stopping at places along the way. Then we have the epilogue. We get little excerpts from Ben's scrapbook that he's been keeping, and it's filled with newspaper clippings about Salem's Lot. And it's just full of people hearing odd noises, people worried about ghosts, people seeing faces in windows, mysterious deaths, disappearances, rumors of wild dog packs, etc. All this in Salem's Lot. So on the 6th of October, Ben and Mark are returning to Salem's Lot. They have decided it's time. The heat index is really high. There's a breeze, and the conditions are kind of right for a recreation, if you will, of the Great Fire of 1951. So they go through the deserted, kind of rundown, overgrown town. There's weeds springing up, there's just no one around, there are signs that are faded, and just really creepy. So they go up near the Marston House, and they're in the woods, and Ben flicks a lit cigarette into a pile of brittle leaves, and there's a gentle breeze that starts a fire, and they watch it for a little bit, and then they leave. And the idea is they're going to use that fire to drive all of the vampires out of their hiding places, and then they're going to go hunt them down. And that is Salem's Lot. It really is my favorite Stephen King book. I think all of the characters have so much depth, and I'm always so interested to read about them. I love the just immersion into the town life, and you get all these secondary characters that have very little to do with the actual book, but they are as much a part of the town as anything else, and it gives it a sense of being genuine, and I love that. It's very important, I think, because the town is also a character in this. So is the house, the Marston House. I feel like that's a character in this book, not just a setting. So I very much enjoy this book and highly recommend. I have a tendency to reread it every fall. To me, probably because it takes place in the fall, it's like a Labor Day type book that I'll read, or late October kind of thing. And I probably won't read it again next year because I'll be in the midst of this Stephen King project, but I highly recommend it. Next step will be reviewing the miniseries, so I will have that up next week. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week. Have a spooky day.